the problem is there are too many tables, there are too many conversations going on. And the problem is really is that you have a relative weakening of the United States, which was really the only institution, the US as an institution that kept this region going. Its military power, its open trading system, were the key institutions that allowed peace and prosperity for such a long time in this. But that power is beginning to weaken in a relative sense. And we have China, which is rising significantly, rapidly. And none of the larger economic crisis would not alter the fact that the West or the US would continue to weaken in a relative sense, and China would continue to rise in a relative sense. Now, if those two central facts are true, then whatever the institutions we might have today might not be able to cope with it as long as the big two do not retain some flexibility, some prudence, some realism in terms of how to go forward. So I would say keep an open mind. None of the present institutions might actually survive the huge transformation we are seeing. But the trick is to keep conversation going between the major players. And whatever table you can find at this point is worth sitting down and talking, because we don't know yet what the overall shape of the room and how these tables are going to fit with each other. Till that picture is not going to be clear for quite some time.
Could I politely disagree with both Steve and Raja on one point? I think we shouldn't overplay the decline of the United States theory, I'm convinced the United States will bounce back from this crisis. I'm convinced that post-crisis, the United States will become stronger than it was before the crisis. And this has been the history of the United States. Its capacity to absorb pain, to bite the bullet, to restructure, to do the right thing. Let us just remember that although China is rising, the Chinese economy is only 1/4 the size of the United States economy at the moment. And the Indian economy, I believe, is 1/10 the size of the United States economy. If you look at the sources of innovation, of invention that will power economies in the 21st century, there is no one that can outcompete the United States. So in my view, and maybe I'm too optimistic about your country, John and Steve, in my view, the United States will remain the single most powerful country in the world for the next 25 to 50 years.
I just add something, I guess, where Professor Mohan talked about, he thought there were too many tables. I might be adding one, but in Ambassador Koh's initial remarks, he talked about how the United States named an ambassador to ASEAN. That ambassador is based in Washington. After that was done, it was the first country to do so, and Australia and Japan followed suit. And so, a question: will other extra-regional powers name an ambassador? There's debate on whether this ambassador should be based in the respective capitals, or whether they should be based in Jakarta, where the ASEAN Secretariat is located. I think that if it were in Jakarta, it would be a useful thing in terms of these ambassadors being able to work together in addressing challenges and opportunities in ASEAN in a constructive and sustained way. And so that's perhaps another table that would be useful, and I think it would demonstrate an interest that the United States is taking a greater interest in Southeast Asia. And speaking as an American, I hope Tommy is right. He is always very optimistic, and the United States is indeed going through very challenging times. But as I said, I hope you're correct in your assessment of what you think the future of the United States will be over the next quarter to half a century.
Let me just add briefly on the decline thesis. I did not interpret Raja's comments as a book on the rise and fall of the great powers, such as was written in the 1980s. I interpreted it as a reference to the fact that the U.S. relative status had declined. I'm also not a declinist in my view of the United States. I think the way Ambassador Koh put it may very well be the case. We'll emerge stronger. But if the world develops the way that I think U.S. foreign policy should encourage it to develop, the relative U.S. position in the world is going to decrease in relative terms because the rise of the rest, which ought to take place, is going to decrease our relative standing in the world. And U.S. foreign policy shouldn't fight that, because a U.S. foreign policy that doesn't believe that other countries benefiting the livelihoods of their people is bad, what kind of a foreign policy is that? So I think the rise of the rest is good, and that means that our relative, in a relative sense, will decline. But that doesn't mean we will decline in terms of our economy and our capabilities.
Can I just say one thing? I think that's exactly the kind of language we need to start talking about. Rather than who's number one, number two, number three, it's a matter of relative language. So I appreciate those comments. Thank you.
If the U.S. is going to be in relative decline, yes, I thought Raja put it a bit strongly from the way you put it. What are the expectations of Japan from the Obama administration? At the moment, of course, everybody is occupied with the crisis, but taking a somewhat longer-term view, Japan would be expected to do more strategically, but Japan seems to have been perfectly satisfied with its present role. It either shows that they are completely paralyzed domestically, which I don't think so, or it shows that they have calculated that the U.S. will remain the number one power.
Japan faces a strategic challenge, and that's how to develop a strategy that can ensure that Japan achieves the status it wants to achieve. At the moment, it has not been able to do so. So it believes strongly in trying to keep the relationship with the United States as sound as possible, but it's not satisfied with that as Japan's long-term status. At the same time, even though at times Japan mismanages its relations with China and Korea, Japan attaches enormous importance to keeping its relations with China on a stable basis, because their economic interests now are tied so closely to those of Japan. So, as we discovered early in the Bush administration, the Japanese do not want to be used by the United States as a pawn against China any more than India wants to be used in that respect. Japan is interested in strengthening relationships with countries around China as an insurance policy against the China that begins to throw its weight around. But it has discovered that it has to do that very carefully, because the countries around China don't want to be used by Japan as part of a cordon sanitaire around China. This is a healthy situation in the sense that nobody wants to launch containment strategies, and nobody's trying overtly to hold down the rise of China, partly because China's rise is bringing other countries along with it, even though it does have an impact on relative standing. I do think, though, there's an aspect of Japan that the United States and regional countries have to pay attention to, and that is the frustration that Japan feels because it wants to be a normal country on an equal status basis with China, and it doesn't know how to get there. By equal status, what I mean is China is a permanent member of the UN Security Council. Japan feels that its economic strength and role in world affairs justifies it being there. It's tried, hasn't been able to develop an effective strategy. Simply being a permanent junior partner of the United States is perhaps not consistent with Japan's longer-term goals, but it doesn't want to give up the U.S. relationship. And so there are objectives that Japan wants to achieve, and it hasn't yet been able to put together an effective strategy for getting there. So I think this requires the careful attention of both the United States and all of the countries around Japan, because a frustrated Japan is a potential source of instability in East Asia, if not managed properly.
Very briefly, I think Daljit's point makes it about language. I think how we use it. I mean, I don't think there's any dispute on that. As the others rise, the relative position. I mean, I think that is the key word. I mean, that the U.S. would alter. That doesn't take away the fact that the U.S. will still be the number one economy, the number one military power for a long time to come. But you already see it in some areas. For example, on trade negotiations, the EU is a powerful player. So, but in the military side, as we said, I mean, the European contributions to NATO, I mean, they're utterly inconsequential today in Afghanistan. So it could be in different planes. You could have a different sets of distribution. But the important thing, I think, is how does the U.S. adapt to this new situation in Asia? There, I think the U.S. has interesting options, actually. U.S. could actually become more powerful in spite of relative decline if it chooses a strategy of offshore balancing and not be the sole manager or the ordering power in the region. The U.S. steps back and says, look, like what Britain did in the 19th century Europe, that you can step back, come in to balance the region when you see a change in the distribution of power in Asia. But at this point, of course, U.S. is the power that shapes the security structure. So it might have interesting options where it steps back a little bit, actually, to be able to have a lot more freedom of action and a lot more influence in a different sense.